Hello, and welcome to Change the Face of Yoga, teaching toddlers through golden oldies. I'm very excited to be talking to lots of yoga teachers who will explain their passion for teaching yoga to students with different ages, physical fitness levels, wellness levels, and different goals. They will explain the benefits of yoga for these students and will be including teacher tips and pose modifications. I am Stephanie Cunningham of Yoga Lightness, and I've been teaching over 50s for 10 years. So this area is my passion and the passion of many other yoga teachers that you will be listening to in this series. Thank you so much for listening, and let's get started. Hello, this is our 100th podcast, and I have an incredible guest that is helping me celebrate 100 podcasts. His name is Lee Blaschke. Lee is quite well-known and very has an incredible reputation in the area of yoga and yoga therapy. He has postgraduate qualifications in health sciences, undergraduate qualifications in counseling, human performance, nutrition, yoga therapy, and Ayurveda. He has over 40 years of experience as a yoga teacher and 25 years as a yoga therapist. He is past president of Yoga Australia and serves on their Council of Advisors and Mentoring Reference Group. He has served the International Association of Yoga Therapists, IAYT, on various committees and their Council of Advisors, and was a founder of the Global Consortium on Yoga Therapy. Yoga was of interest to Lee in the 1960s, and he commenced teaching yoga in the 1970s. He has been studying with A.G. Mohan in India and other traditions, including Swami Gitananda and Sri Yogendra. He was introduced to Ayurveda in the 1980s and subsequently developed his studies in India with Dr. David Frawley. Most recently, he has been drawn to iRest and the teaching of Dr. Richard Miller and is a certified iRest teacher, supervisor, and mentor. Welcome, Lee. Is there anything else you'd like to add to that introduction? You know, we could take the whole podcast and say about the wonderful things you've done. But
Thank you for welcoming me, Stephanie, and welcome to all the listeners on this auspicious podcast. What do I need to add? Yes, I think I need a rest after listening to all of that. Goodness gracious.
Well, it's very impressive. Very, very impressive.
Well, I just think it's simply yoga in action, I guess you'd say, that one lives one's life in. If I was fortunate enough to start yoga quite early on in my life, as a teenager, and when it becomes the underlying foundation and perhaps the underlying operating system of your life, you tend to be able to do a range of things and have a life fully lived and hopefully well lived, without it feeling like it's all that daunting.
Okay, great. So our topic today is one that Lee wants to talk about and he felt was important and was within the theme of the 100th podcast, where we have really been exploring what yoga is and can be. And I will put these in the show notes, but Lee has produced some videos about this topic. And I think to really come down to the basis of those videos is probably as close as I can come this sentence. What will the future consider that we're doing with yoga in our time? Is it a good package of suiting our time, honoring our traditions, and that future generations can say it served people well? I think that's an excellent question. Does yoga serve people well today? And Lee, why don't you take it from there and explain why you think this is an important question?
Thank you, Stephanie. Yes, I think it's really important that we understand that yoga is with us today in 2019 and across the globe in every continent, and I mean every continent. I do know of some people in Macquarie Island and McMurdo Sound who actually practice yoga at Antarctica. So it's on every continent now, which is great. And it is being able to do so because of its ability to keep a relevance to the various social, cultural mores of those particular times, whilst at the same time maintaining a good, let's call it the silver thread, the cord, back to its traditions, even if the yoga itself that is being practiced in modern times might look quite different to the yoga that was practiced in what we might call the ancient times. And that is only natural and right, because the beauty of yoga is something that is relevant at any one particular time. Yoga was not developed, or the principles of yoga, and I'll come back to when I say yoga, that's a big question, what is yoga? But let's say that the yoga that most people listening here are familiar with, which is really a combination of Hatha Yoga, which developed from around about the 11th, 12th century AD from the Tantric tradition, combined with what we might call the classical or Raj Yoga, which is strongly informed by Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, with smatterings of other philosophies woven in. But predominantly those two approaches sort of trying to weave together. Well, over the hundreds of years, how could it be the same and be relevant and be serving its communities if it stayed exactly the same? It has to adapt, it has to move with the times. And so the question that I often ask yoga teachers, and to me, when I like to mentor or teach, I think it's much more fun to pose questions rather than give people a dump of information. And the question I love to ask, and so I will ask it again, is really what is the legacy? And you referred to this in that sort of opening summation, Stephanie. What is the legacy that we are leaving? And I'm particularly talking as those of us who are yoga teachers, and I understand that your audience, of course, is a combination of people with various depths and interests in yoga. But if somebody 100 years' time or 200 years' time looks back and says, what was yoga like in the beginning of the 21st century, just the way we look back now and say, what was yoga like in the second half of the 19th century, when it was very informed by the British Army. The physical practice of yoga then was strongly influenced by the British Army. And because yoga itself was driven underground a little bit because the British culture and somewhat some of the religious traditions of the British Empire were overrunning, if you like, some of the traditions of India. But we look back and we can see what was happening with yoga in those days, and we think, well, how did that suit the times? How will people in 2250 look back, and how did yoga suit the times now? Now, we don't know the answer to that question, but what we can contemplate and we can contribute to, whether we're teachers or simply a practitioner of yoga who enjoys the practice once a week or does a meditation every day, is, am I really understanding that what I am doing is in accord with the tradition of yoga and leads to the outcome of yoga, and in a way that is relevant to me now? Now, let me expand that just a little bit. Yoga predominantly, when you read most of the seminal texts speaking about yoga, the majority of what is written is about the state of yoga. Very little is actually written about the practice of yoga. What is written about is various practices to do different things that lead to the state of yoga. So in the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, for example, a classic text of, and people have slightly different opinions, but 15th, 16th century, around that era, it's about we do practices that will help move subtle energies from one subtle energy channel into another in order for it to be raised up into a higher energy center in our body in order to achieve a state of yoga, and or to pacify various imbalances in what we call our dosha, which people who understand Ayurveda know that there's how the elements of air, water, and fire in particular can become imbalanced, how we rebalance those through various practices that leads to the state of yoga. That's one form of yoga. Or if we look at what Raj Yoga through Patanjali has to say, well, yoga really is something to do with reducing these aberrant movements and fluctuations of the mind that take us away from residing in our true nature. And then there's a whole range of practices that are given that aren't called yoga. There's a practice called asana, and there's a practice called pranayama, and there's these practices of mitahara or lifestyle practices, the yama and the yama, etc., the meditations. So when we say we are practicing yoga, we need to ask ourselves, are we practicing something that leads to the state of yoga? And you can look at so many other descriptions. For example, the Bhagavad Gita, of course, one of the great respected texts, a little over 2,000 years old in the yoga tradition, speaks in various ways about yoga. One, it says, samatvam yoguchyate. Yoga is a state of equipoise, where whatever's going on, we feel we can handle it. We're in the middle of the seesaw, or in the United States, there's a different name for a seesaw. I forget what it is now, but
teeter-totter.
That's it. Thank you. Teeter-totter. Yeah. So we're in the middle, when we're not going up and down all the time, or that we can understand a sense of a stillness in action, and a sense of acting in life without attachment to the fruits of those actions. These are all the states of yoga. And so when we say, what is yoga, and are we keeping yoga in our yoga teaching and in our yoga practice, it's really about, are we really achieving the benefits of a state of yoga irrespective of the practices that we do? And this then speaks to the relevance of practices at the time. Now, in our contemporary societies, in the main, of course, that varies across the globe, but let's say that the majority of your audience are people who are techno-savvy and sit on their backsides a fair bit of the time, and predominantly in what we might call westernized countries, or first world countries, probably. Our need is a little different to what somebody's need might have been many, many years ago, who had an active lifestyle doing various things and who wasn't educated and needed to be guided with things. So the practices that we use now in order to achieve the state of equipoise, to achieve a sense of stillness in action, or be able to perform an action without attachment to the fruits of action, or to achieve some sense of stillness of the aberrant modifications of movements of the mind that take us away from our true nature, any of these goals of yoga, what is it we need to do in order to achieve that state. Now, that may well be that we need to do a lot of mindful and appropriate asana because our lives are out of balance somehow when we just need to reconnect with the sensations of our body, the felt sense of life, if you like, in order to then start getting into those deeper levels of understanding about ourselves. For others who are highly active, it may well be that they need to be doing a lot more, spending a lot more time in their introspection, self-reflection, meditation, unless I focus upon asana. 250 years ago, in agrarian societies, very active, sometimes they needed something that was not physical based, but they often needed to work with their breath or particular meditations, or in societies years gone by, the yoga practice was actually more attuned to what we might see as a religious practice, chanting of the mantra and performing various rituals, the homa, the fire rituals, etc. And this reminds me of a beautiful story told to me by a yoga teacher friend. He came back from the Kumbh Mela many years ago. It was the very early, probably around about 2003 or 4. And he was very proud that he went down beside the Ganga and he had his little tent and he rolled out his yoga mat first thing in the morning at 5:30. He flapped his mat out on the grass and there's millions of people milling around. And he's starting to do his Surya Namaskar, his sun salutations, very proudly and doing them in a nice way that he was taught. And a wandering sadhu came up to him, hardly clad in anything, and the matted hair, the ash, the whole thing. And the guy's staring at him. And so my friend says, well, hello. And he says, the guy looks and says, oh, so what is it you're doing here, this piece of rubber? What is this jumping about? And my friend Patty says, I'm doing my yoga, sir. I'm doing my yoga practice. And the guy starts laughing and cackling. Oh, he said, yoga you want? He said, here is the Ganga. Jump in the water. There's your yoga. So this guy's wandered for how many months, we don't know, to come to this great ritual that happens once every 12 years to immerse himself in the holy river. That was the man's yoga. And he would have been saving up for this for his, to do it once every 12 years. This is the highlight of the guy's life. So what is yoga for one person is not necessarily yoga for the other. So that then brings us around to this other point. Does that mean that anything we do, we can start calling yoga because we've decided we've got an intention that it's going to be yoga? And this is a very vexed question because it's one that leads us to assumptions about what is somebody's intention. So you could make the case that if somebody's doing something in particular, they're weeding their garden in a particular way with a certain mindfulness, a certain presence, and leading to the goals and outcomes that we would classify as yoga, can a case be made that that is a yoga practice? Leaving that as an open question. Somebody decides that they're going to attract a lot of people to some modern approach to yoga, and so they set up a nice Facebook page and invite as many goats as long as they can. And we know what I'm referring to here, and it's probably not a person on this planet that has seen the clips of the goat yoga, all very entertaining. But we ask the question, is that yoga? Now, I'm not saying yes or no, it's yoga. It's not my job to do that. Everybody has their own right and feeling about these things. But the question that's more important to ask is, how would any practice be considered a yoga practice? In other words, how is yoga kept in the yoga practice? And I think one of the answers to that is, firstly, what I said before, does it lead to the outcomes of yoga? Well, one might say, well, the same outcomes can be achieved from a Buddhist meditation practice or possibly any deep religious meditation practice or any other lifestyle practices, the practices of Qigong and Tai Chi, etc., be said to be leading to the same outcome. So what makes it yoga? Well, yoga has a tradition. And it's not a tradition for blank tradition's sake. This is not Fiddler on the Roof, where we just sing about, we don't know why we do it, but it's just tradition, so we do it. It's understanding that in the tradition, whichever of the yoga traditions we come from, they all have their various qualities, features. But if we are to, just for the moment, talk about this synthesis I was talking about before of a strange combination of Hatha Yoga and Raj Yoga, which is the predominant yoga in the West. And when I'm saying the West, I'm really meaning the contemporary world. This is whether it be Asia, Africa, or anywhere else. That there are features that come from the tradition which could be Hatha Yoga, which is a tradition, the Samkhya Yoga, which is a tradition, Samkhya, which is an ancient, Samkhya Karika was an ancient text that has deeply informed the underlying principles of our contemporary yoga. And even going further back into some of the Upanishads, which go back between around about 200 or 300 BC to about 1200 BC, and even further back into the Vedas, there are particular features that we identify as yoga, particularly, and the Samkhya texts elucidate these possibly in as much depth as anywhere else. Features such as our multi-layered, multimodal existence. I'm referring here to the pancha maya, the 5 layers or sheaths of our being. Our body sheath, our pranic sheath, our mental, emotional sheath, our intellectual sheath, our sheath of connectedness and joy and the like. That's part of the tradition. So are the principles, and very importantly, the principles of the triguna, the 3 guna of sattva, rajas, tamas, which are highly detailed in Samkhya, which basically says that all of manifest existence, all of the phenomena world, which is grouped under this term prakriti, are formed of varying combinations of these, and we don't actually have a really direct Western word for them. So I just like to still stay with the word guna, that we have this sense of balance and lightness with energy and passion, with inertia and groundedness. And everything's a combination of these things in an appropriate combination for the appropriate time. Now, one could make a case that if your yoga practice is not in accord with the needs of balancing the 3 guna, then it's not in accord with yoga tradition. One could make a case or ask the question, does it really need to have some relationship to working with an understanding of the pancha maya, or these 5 sheaths of existence? Again, I'm asking the question, not providing an exact answer, because I just don't think anybody can provide a single answer to somebody else, which itself highlights what I think is the fundamental which forms a yoga practice. And that is that we all need to have our own deep introspection about what it is we're doing. When we're doing a physical practice, it needs to be interoceptive. In other words, we need to be feeling it from within, not just proprioceptively sensing it from without. But we need to be thinking through, what is it we are doing? And if we are truly reflecting about what we are doing, we will come up with the answers ourselves in our particular circumstance, whether we are addressing an imbalance in the triguna and whether that's relevant in our practice today, whether we are addressing particular needs of the panchamaya and whether that's being addressed today, whether in fact we are balancing out some imbalance of the tridosha, these imbalances of the air, water, and fire elements that sort of align a little bit with Ayurveda, because again, that's part of some of the Hatha Yoga tradition. We need to reflect upon that. Or are we, in fact, working with energy channels and energy centers, which again, strongly part of the Tantric and Hatha Yoga tradition? Are we, in fact, working with the energies in our left and right channels, moving them into our central channel? And I'm trying to minimize Sanskrit words a little bit, so this is not exclusive.
Mm-hmm.
Are we aware of the energy centers that are commonly known as chakra? These are all the questions when we're reflecting on our practice that help us decide whether what it is we are doing is yoga or it is just habitual moving around in our body, or habitual breathing, or habitual gazing at something without being connected, or whether we are doing some physical exercise that just happens to look like yoga postures, or breathing exercise that happens to look like pranayama. These are deep questions. Now, I certainly wouldn't be saying to somebody who's new to the field of yoga, look, in order to do a yoga practice, you need to contemplate all these things. But somebody who is a yoga teacher certainly should be starting on the journey of these contemplations. And somebody who is an experienced yoga teacher, especially someone who's training other yoga teachers, needs to be not just asking these questions, but to have asked and to have explored these questions many times over. And then, of course, what happens is we are maintaining a sense of tradition. And because this is happening in the minds of people now, it means even though we are connecting with the tradition, we are keeping it current and we're keeping it contextualized to what's happening now. And so if we think about somebody who's new to yoga, and you mentioned to me earlier, Stephanie, that one of our wonderful colleagues and beautiful author, Anne Swanson in the States. And Anne, if you're listening, sending you a big hug and look forward to seeing you in June in the States. How do we try and keep an aliveness of these philosophies in the minds and practices of someone who's absolutely new to yoga? And I would suggest that the first and most important answer is modeling. It comes back to authenticity. And I think if you're authentically practicing your own yoga and you have got a sense of integration of yoga into your life, you're practicing authentically, and there's a sense of connectedness with what you're doing, then that's going to come across. You're putting it out. You are resonating how yoga philosophies work in your life. And you don't even need to say it. People pick up on it. They say, well, I went to this teacher and they just seem so at ease. They seem so together. There's something about this yoga. I don't know if it's just because they're doing these postures every day or they're chanting something every day, but there's something about that. And then what happens is the curiosity builds. And I've found over the decades that by allowing curiosity to build and actively feeding the curiosity, people will come and they'll ask the questions, tell me more. And so I don't think we need to be feeding them philosophies. I mean, obviously some basics. It's nice for them to know that, where yoga came from, and that it does include a range of practices and that there's, a range of traditions. There's certain things you may want to say to them. But I'm a big believer in the learning that can come from the doing. That if somebody does a small practice and they start to feel something and they see you doing a practice, or they see you living your life with integrity and authenticity, then they're going to get something out of that. And they're already getting the philosophy. I don't know that we need to drill it into them. Having said that, I personally, when I used to teach a few yoga classes, hatha-based yoga classes, everything I teach is yoga, but most of my group classes over the years have been meditation-based, and of course nowadays I rest and things like that. But I did a lot more one-on-one work with my teaching of asana and pranayama, etc. But in group sessions, I would often talk about something that's meaningful in life. To say, you know what, if I'm having a series of 6 or 8 sessions in your weekly sessions, the second week and the fourth week and the sixth week, say, you know what, let's take 10 minutes and just have a chat about something that could be useful in your life. And I might put it out there saying, does anybody have a question, the way you did for this podcast, Stephanie? Or simply throw a seed question in. And the discussion that comes out of that leads into discussion about philosophy. And it could be something very, very day-to-day and very mundane. You know, what's going on in the world today? You know, what's happening with refugees, or what's happening with extremism, or some topic that's very real, very day-to-day. And let's see what the yogic approach might be to that. So there's lots of ways of weaving in philosophy. But underlying it all, it needs to be authentic. No point in trying to have a little bit of a mini satsang in a beginner's yoga class if that's not your way. You just need to be completely authentic to the way you do things, and people will pick up on that authenticity. It's the sine qua non. If you try and be something that is not your way, trying to do it some other way, particularly like mimicking some other teacher, being a clone, it doesn't work. The other thing which I think is very useful in this is a little adage I've been saying for years to teacher trainees over the years, and it often kept being sent back to me because they like it. As teachers, our role is not to be a sage on the stage. It's to be a guide by the side. So, and this is what it's about, that we, by being very real and very accessible, I think that also invites the resonance with the students. We did go through a period of yoga teachers being inaccessible. They were sort of very special. You know, they were the keepers of a certain flame, and a lot of yoga teachers bought into that, and chests were puffed up, and so I think people have woken up to that. Lots of leading teachers around the world who train other teachers and inspire people are turning that around. You know, I mean, I'm thinking of the likes of the Donna Fahis and the Amy Wheelers. These are people who really show that you're side by side with somebody in the journey. No matter how respected you are, you're not the sage. You might have some good ideas. You might have some experience. But authentic humility, integrity means we are sitting with people when we're teaching them and when we're practicing with them. So let me take a breather and have a sip of my water, and you might like to reflect on that and see if I've gone too far off the track, and you can pull me back on it, because I tend to go on tangents.
No, I think you've stayed on track very well, and I have nothing to add to that. But I guess I would add or ask, how does this fit in with the guru culture that is really part of yoga?
Yeah. Okay. So that was literally that word was on my lips before I decided I better take a break first before I buy into guru.
I read your mind. Okay.
You must have. Wow. Zoom is a powerful tool. Yeah. So this gets back to the relevance of times. And of course, there's a sour taste in a lot of people's mouths now because of inappropriate behavior and abuse by gurus. Not just in the yoga tradition, of course. Obviously in many countries we have it in other religious traditions. There have been many senior yoga teachers who have fallen from grace, and particularly those that were really regarded as gurus. And the guru, the word is different translations, but one who shines the light, and similar translations to that, or remover of darkness is another way it's used. I think a good teacher is, in fact, a guru who helps remove some darkness and helps shine some light on the path. A good yoga teacher will do that. But when we use the word guru in its traditional sense, the guru was almost to be worshipped. The guru was, the person who was so connected to the divine realities, and there was almost a sense of the devotees, the acolytes, were just had to rely on the guru for all the wisdom and all the answers and all the practices. Now, in a time when the majority of people weren't highly educated in the way we see it, they were educated in many other things, but their cultural norm was to not inquire into a whole lot of things where there is a priestly class or a guru who does those things for you. Well, that was just accepted. You listened to that teacher and did what she or he said, and most of the time it was he. Not unlike people in various churches put those particular priests on the pedestal and were told, did what they were told. And, we don't need to go into details as to how astray that has gone. So I think we have an inquiring mind now, which is good. But I do want to say, and as much as I caution people about the old approach to guru worship, I think that doesn't fit with our contemporary societies. But the principle of somebody who is there to act as a guide, a teacher, or a mentor, I think is very important. And this is where mentorship, I think, is so valuable. I'm so pleased that Yoga Australia, as the peak body for yoga teachers here in Australia, is once again leading the world by establishing a formalized mentorship program, which will be probably announced towards the end of this year. I have the privilege of sitting on a steering committee for that. And there'll be a range of senior teachers with strong backgrounds who will be available to mentor teachers in training or younger teachers to take the role of what in previous days would have been the role of a guru. But, of course, in mentoring, we do things a little differently. We ask the questions, we stimulate the curiosity, and we encourage the self-efficacy of the person that we're mentoring. So I think it has a place, but not under the name guru. And very interestingly, when I first started studying with A.G. Mohan in the 90s, I vaguely recall mentioning something about the word guru, and they said, "Look, I'm your spiritual friend and someone to guide you. I'm not guru. It's not what it's about." And I thought it was very, very wise. And I know that someone like Dr. Ananda Balayogi, very respected medical doctor and yoga therapist and head of the International Center for Yoga Therapy in Pondicherry, often says, I'm a teacher, and yes, I come from a lineage, but I'm really your friend here to support you. Now, he grew up in a tradition where his father was his guru, unquestionably. But he has recognized the importance of a contemporary approach that is more suited to people nowadays. So I think we can avoid a lot of problems and trouble by not really using the word guru unless it's absolutely part of a tradition where there's no option. I don't know one at this stage that operates certainly in Australia that way. But at the same time, to not throw out this concept of somebody senior is there to always help you and guide you, no matter who it is. I mean, I'm fairly senior in yoga in Australia, but I'm a minnow in the great pond of yoga across the ages, and I have mentors. Some of the people that I mentor me. Richard Miller is a mentor. Amy Wheeler is a mentor. We might mentor each other. So it's something which I think is really important, no matter how far we've gone down the track. Another person to bounce things off and to sit with and to resonate with is really, really important, which then raises that whole question of, well, what about someone who doesn't want to go to a yoga teacher at all? There's lots of videos, there's online stuff, huge amounts of online material. Well, yes, you can certainly watch and follow along on some things. And, with modern streaming, etc., there is some pretty good quality and you can get quite a good feel for that teacher. But I don't think they take the place of actually sitting face to face with that teacher at some stage, not all the time. You can do beautiful online training and occasionally meet with the teachers. Equally, you can do some lovely yoga practice and start achieving some of the benefits of yoga online, but come together with that teacher every so often. It will stand you in good stead. And that coming together could be synchronous online streaming, so it's real time where you can ask questions, if that's all the option you have. If you're in Udnadatta, and I don't know there's a yoga teacher in Udnadatta, and for those overseas, Udnadatta's pretty well spot in the middle of Australia and hundreds of kilometres from anywhere. That's, you might only have that option, but as long as there's a connection. And when you have a connection with somebody, then you know that you've got a better chance of maintaining the tradition. And tradition, not to be confused with lineage. I'll just briefly speak about that. In fact, I delved into that quite a bit last week at a satsang. A lineage is where you have a particular teacher teaches a particular way and says, this will be my successor, and it follows on in a very strict way, and it hardly ever changes what it does over a long, long period of time. Things stay very much the same. That lineage may come from a particular tradition of Hatha Yoga tradition, or a viniyoga tradition, or a Rishi cultural tradition. So tradition is different to lineage. So tradition is what ties us back to the original texts and what yoga is really about. Lineage is really about a person who teaches a particular way and people follow that particular way.
Okay. Another thing that's pretty discussed, shall we say, in yoga today is that we've taken over the tradition and we haven't. I'm unclear about what the real issue is, but I believe that it is that we've taken the tradition from India and we have appropriated it, and we haven't given sufficient thought or accolades to the people that developed it. How does that fit in with your thoughts about contemporary yoga?
Sure. This is something which I discussed at great length, probably for close to an hour last Friday night. And if you think it's appropriate, later on, I can share with you a link to that recording. And if you feel it's appropriate, you may want to share it with your audience, but we'll take that offline separately. But to sum that up, a lot of this comes back to this idea of tradition. When you recognize that we are teaching something that is from a particular tradition, and that we call yoga, and some might give it a particular name of yoga, Hatha Yoga, Jnana Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Karma Yoga, etc. then we are acknowledging already that there is a particular source of this. But I think what a lot of people have been concerned about, and I've heard this from a number of my friends who are Indian teachers or people who have spent a lot of time in India and studied in lineages as well as tradition, is to what are we doing taking all this Sanskrit stuff and not knowing really what it's about and starting to do a lot of things with it. And a classic example is, for example, there's a manufacturer of mats. There's probably many of them, but one was online recently and there was a bit of a discussion with images of Ganesh on the mat where people are standing.
Mm.
Now, in the tradition of yoga, and particularly from the Indian culture, you do not stand on a murti or an image of a deity. And so I think that's a respect issue. And when we do things, and so, for example, we go and call a brand of clothing, namaste pants or something, we're taking a word that has a particular meaning. Now, I use the word namaste a lot in my sign-offs on emails because I understand the word. When I'm signing off, before I sign off, I sit and I think for a moment about who I'm signing off to, and I try and connect with them from my heart to their heart. And that's why I used the word namaste. But just to use something like that flippantly, yeah, are we misappropriating? Are we avoiding the acknowledgement? And we could even take it further and saying that sometimes we are taking things from the broader field of yoga and the traditions of yoga and not applying asteya. Asteya, one of the great instructions in yoga from Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, of not misappropriating, non-stealing. And if we are taking something and not acknowledging its source, that is misappropriation. Now, to be taking something and saying, this comes from the great tradition of so-and-so, Swami Gitananda Pondicherry says this, that, and the other, and this practice comes from his tradition. And, for example, I use some of his practices quite a bit, and I build them into some of the kriyas. But it's always acknowledged where it comes from. And if you want to learn further, then you go to that tradition and learn more about it, because this is a beautiful practice from that tradition. So it is important, but it's also important in a bigger picture that we go and say yoga. Okay, yoga, this great gift of India to the world, and somebody goes and does something about putting on their skimpiest bikini and standing on one hand on a rock and taking as many photographs as possible and putting it on Facebook and in extreme, what we might call acrobatic positions, some of which may not have a yoga posture name, and calling that yoga. To me, that might seem inappropriate. For others, it may not, but that's a question I would ask. The people need to consider that. Is that an appropriate use of the word yoga when it has absolutely nothing to do with, may have nothing to do with the achievement of the goals of yoga? It's not really connecting to the practices of yoga. There's no introspection invited. And it's starting to use possibly inappropriate imagery for the sake of getting some hits online and exciting the trolls. So there's a whole range of things we could ask the question about misappropriation. To me, if it's yoga, if it's genuinely yoga, fine. It can be called yoga. You acknowledge the tradition when you teach. If you've developed something yourself, many people have invented a yoga posture. And you say, I think I may have actually thought this yoga posture up, but it comes from the tradition of yoga. I'm calling this a yoga posture because it does these things. It's introspective. There's interoception practice of it. It's helping with this panchamaya. It's helping to balance the gunas. It's working towards the greater goals of yoga. It fits with these other lines of yoga practices. So I've now invented a yoga practice. an asana, for example. Well, I think that may be valid, even though it may not be listed in a list of asanas somewhere. Because if you look at the asanas that we practice now, go back and look at the Hatha Yoga Pradipika or the Gahamanda Samhita, some of the two great texts of outlining practices of asana. Half of what we're practicing nowadays in yoga classes aren't there. Some of them, most people believe, were developed as part of the fitness regime for the British Army in India in consultation with some of the yogis they came across. So they co-developed some various practices. And in fact, if you look at, there's an old fitness program that was used by the British Army way back, called 10BX program. And some of these we see as in yoga classes now. So when does a physical exercise become a yoga posture? That's part of that same question.
Yes.
And you can import something into yoga sometimes if it checks all the boxes about, does it really help somebody achieve the benefits of yoga, and that it fits with what the tradition of yoga is about. Now, I would probably argue the case that showing yourself off in a skimpy clothing on a rock overlooking Sydney Harbour, doing something that probably has more danger involved with it than anything you call an asana, is probably not going to cut it as a new yoga posture. It might cut it as a way of promoting a new line of clothing, and that's about all. But if somebody is sitting on a chair and decides that there's some particular way they can move their leg that really helps alleviate some issues in a hip, you can create some extra stiram sukham, some steadiness and comfort in somebody, well, I think they may well have adapted or created a new asana. So, it's a really, really broad question, and I don't think there's any specific and individual answer other than coming back to authenticity and integrity of the person teaching and practicing. And I think some consistency in this as well, being consistent with what we're doing. Yeah, we were talking about this last week about the ICE principle, integrity, consistency. No, so the CIA principle, CIA. The consistency, integrity, and authenticity as a triangle. And if we have all of those things happening, then we're not likely to misappropriate, and we're not likely to say something's yoga that's really a bit of a stretch to call it yoga. And therefore, there's going to be greater consistency in what people are going to think yoga is, and more people are going to get the benefit, because if there's consistency in what yoga is, not standardization, but consistency, that there needs to be certain things there for it to be called yoga, then I think yoga goes back to its foundational strengths. It has been said by many people that in some places around the world it has been teetering a little bit as to whether it has lost its way a little bit. And I can see where that argument is there. I think there's enough of it that is solid and founded strongly on tradition that it's overall it's not going to lose its way. But I'd hate to think the majority of people are being attracted to these quasi practices that are being called yoga because yoga is just a good marketing name now. I share the concerns of a lot of people, but that's why we have people like yourself, Stephanie, having wonderful podcasts of people coming and sharing and discussing so that we can all learn and keep our focus and keep yoga strong and relevant. And let's hope that it continues for another 2,000 years in societies and beyond.
Yes, I agree. Yes, there's been some wonderful guests who have really been very impressive about how they use yoga to guide their students. Okay, so we're almost at the end. Is there anything that you want to add that you feel we haven't covered or we haven't covered in enough depth?
Yeah. What I would like to say is conclusion, and apart from thanking you, of course, for your both your wisdom and your initiative in 100 episodes is quite a milestone, and I feel very flattered and humbled by being asked to be on that particular milestone. But I think one is to encourage anybody listening to not be afraid to start a yoga practice. It doesn't need to be an hour and a half on a mat. A yoga practice can be something very short, very simple, and ultimately yoga can become the software of your life, so that a lot of what you do in your life is helping you towards your goals as yoga can assist them. So start. And a lovely saying that Richard Miller often uses in relation to IREST is a little bit and often. Rather than saying, I'll try once a week or once a fortnight to go to that long class or go and do that retreat once every 3 months, those things are great. Do them. But better still, every day, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, give yourself time, sit down, lie down, go to a teacher every so often, get them to give you a practice for 10 minutes. Ask your teacher, can you give me something to do for 10 minutes in the morning and night so I can keep on track with my yoga practice? Because it's the regularity, and Patanjali has said it in the Yoga Sutra, it is that consistent, regular practice over a long period of time is what yields the results.
Okay. Great way to end the podcast. Thank you so much, Leah. You've, as usual, gone beyond any expectations that really to make us think about what we are as teachers and therapists and what yoga means to us and to our teaching. So thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful interview. If you would like to be a guest on Changing the Face of Yoga, please go to my website, www.yogalightness.com.au, and under the Changing the Face of Yoga tab, you can complete Be Our Guest form. After reviewing the form and finding it applicable to this podcast, we will send you a link to schedule an interview. Please download, review, and tell your friends of any podcasts that are of interest to you and to them. If you would like to contact me, send an email to info@yogalightness.com.au. And thank you for listening to Changing the Face of Yoga.